Strauss. Introduction to Political Philosophy, Session 4, January 18th, 1965.
Now, Mr. Astrael would be grateful if you would announce to your classes that on Wednesday, January 20th at 4 p.m. in the lounge of Foster Hall, there will be a meeting between interested students and a group of visiting Soviet writers, including one, quote, literary rebel, unquote. All members of the department are invited. Good. And now, you were the one, Here is this question. Karl Popper claims that science can be separated from non-science on non-verificationist principles, and agrees that the verificationist separation is untenable. If this claim is true, it would mean that a value-free social science was possible. Well, in the first place, I must say, what does verificationist mean? No, honestly, I do not know. I simply do not know what it means. And then, I do not see the connection between this assertion and the possibility or impossibility of a value-free science in general or social science in particular. Could you figure out, or could you explain us what it means?
For verification is simply that if you ask the question, if someone presents a proposition and they say that all crows are black, standard one. If someone presents a proposition,
yes,
and a verificationist would ask, how do you know? And this, according to the preparer, leads to an infinite regress. And he says that at the end of this infinite regress, according to their philosophy, is their answer, which is, well, I don't know, but I will only ask questions that are in principle falsifiable.
I see. Well, does it not amount to this, ultimately, that the attempt to reject certain questions as meaningless, as distinguished from untrue, begs the question? You know, well, when the question is raised, these so-called metaphysical questions regarding the whither and where, as Kant puts it, and they cannot be answered by science, admittedly. And then the question arises, but are these not the most important concerns of man, and is therefore science not of a very limited value? Then one can try to get rid of this difficulty by saying, these questions cannot be answered by science, but for this very reason they are meaningless questions. So you see, then you have solved the problem by definition, i.e. completely arbitrarily. And I believe what he means by, Popper rejects that probably, and says that, but what he means by this, that science can be separated from non-science on non-verificationist principles. What he means by that, I simply do not know, and therefore I cannot answer your question. Perhaps you spell it out for us next time. It will do you very good.
It's a long, it's a 500 book.
Yeah, but still the main point should be, I mean, I know Popper's position in a general way from some of his publications, but I could not. Now, I know Popper takes the ordinary view, or the ordinary positivistic view with greater, he's more careful than some of the other writers of this kind are, but the difficulty in Popper comes in rather another way, that he tries to establish his position, his frankly valued position, not scientific position, regarding permissive egalitarianism, by attacking the men opposed to it, such people as Plato, Hegel, etc. And now but in doing that, he proceeds in a most unscholarly manner, i.e. in a most unscientific manner. And therefore there is something very awkward if someone whose principle is science is unable to behave scientifically when it counts. This is my objection to Popper. No, I think, in a way, sure, why it's a mere accident. But I believe the question is whether there is not a deeper necessity for that, namely whether the lacking concern for understanding this position is not due to the fundamental certainty that this cannot, since say Plato, this cannot be true as Plato meant it, because Plato meant it as scientifically or objectively true, he doesn't take the necessary trouble of studying it. That's a bit more complex. Let us disregard Popper altogether, since the relevant point to which you referred has not become clear to me, and I suppose to no one else. Or is there someone who knows these things of Popper and would like to take them up?
Do you mean what he means by verification?
What this issue is, science can be separated from non-science or non-verification principle.
No, what he would call Kant a verification. Yeah.
Pardon?
He would call Kant a verification in that, in the end, when he asked, if he were to ask Kant the question, how do you know this? Kant would have to say, I know this by common sense and by empirical studies. So he says this to Karl Popper is verification, and this leads to infinite regress.
Yeah.
That's what he means by verification.
And where do we begin then? I mean, how do we avoid that infinite regress?
Well, according to him, you avoid it by saying at the end, well, I don't know. All I can say is that it can be falsifiable. That if any propositions that are not falsifiable, he won't deal with. He'll only deal with propositions that are falsifiable. So he'll say to the person he's talking with, well, help me falsify.
But without saying that
without saying that he said he believes that most theories and propositions are false, indeed, and that science proceeds by falsifying these theories. And so what he will say is that I don't know, and the path remains to be falsified.
Well, I suggest that we take you would give us a somewhat more detailed report about it, and unfortunately I do not have the time now to read it. Good. Now I have spoken of the crucial change which positivism has undergone after Kant. Namely, the realization that science or reason is unable to substantiate value judgments. Social science cannot settle conflicts between fundamentally different preferences. When considering Kant, we saw that science must leave open the questions raised by theology and metaphysics. In Kant's formulations, the questions regarding the why as distinguished from the how, and that this fact endangers the claim of science to be the guide of men, a claim which Kant raises on behalf of science, and which endangers the claim of science to take the place formerly occupied by theology and metaphysics. That claim of science to be the guide is still more endangered, of course, in the moment in which science becomes value-free, because we may conceivably turn our backs to the question of the why, or where and whither. We cannot well turn our back to the question of how we should live, how we should act. Now, the practical consequence of this ex-inanition of science is what has been called the flight from scientific reason to something else, which, whatever that may be, which claims to give men guidance. I think that is a fact, but it is concealed from us by the following state of affairs. A state of affairs which creates the delusion that a value-free social science can nevertheless guide us. Now, take the simple example supplied by the present situation, the last elections. President Johnson's program is based on certain values, which, from the point of view of social science, are as good or as bad as any others. Say they are as good or as bad as those of Senator Goldwater. But only the values cherished by Johnson have a sufficiently powerful political appeal, as was shown by the election, or are in step with the time. The argument that Senator Goldwater is the horse and buggy values and therefore of no interest. Now, if we broaden the spectrum somewhat and go much beyond the United States, we have seen that fascism has failed completely. And of Marxism, one can very well say that while it has been conspicuously successful in some respects, it is theoretically or scientifically wrong. The great conservative statesmen in our age, Churchill and de Gaulle, failed in the decisive point. Churchill had said, "I have not become His Majesty's Prime Minister in order to supervise the liquidation of the British Empire." And de Gaulle said similar things about Algeria, and look what has happened. In brief, to summarize this kind of thing, which you all know, merely factual considerations of what is possible and politically possible now decide in favor of what is now called the liberal line. That means, however, that science, value-free science, decides in favor of liberalism. This is one important part in our present situation. And from this point of view, the social science relativism regarding the values is a purely scholastic or academic affair, which has no practical meaning. It is perfectly possible to take this view and say, but we must see, the question is only this. Granted that this is a wave of the future, and therefore the question of whether it's good or bad cannot arise, because you can't do anything against the wave of the future. The question is whether this difficulty does not raise its ugly head in another way around. Now, I would like first to read to you an old passage, which you will see has some relevance, but perhaps not sufficient relevance. Very briefly, what people think today, many people today think, is this. We know where the development goes. A thermonuclear war is an insanity, and unless some insane individual like Hitler will ever come to power anywhere, there will not be a thermonuclear war. This will be avoided. Surely the Russian system will become more liberal. The consumers' goods demand will make themselves felt, and on the other hand, the West will become more socialistic, and we can see that even China will eventually modify, because this will not always be the case. And so there is a development in front of us which is both obviously possible, and perhaps more than possible, and in addition absolutely sensible. There is no problem, no fundamental problem. Now, I would like, the first passage which I read to you is from Nietzsche's Zarathustra, near the beginning. Zarathustra addresses the multitude. One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. I say unto you, you still have chaos in yourselves. Alas, the time is coming when man will no longer give birth to a star. Alas, the time of the most despicable man is coming, he that is no longer able to despise himself. Behold, I show you the last man. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? Thus asks the last man, and he blinks. The earth has become small, and on it hops the last man who makes everything small. His race is as ineradicable as a flea beetle. The last man lives longest. We have invented happiness, says the last man, and they blink. They have left the regions where it was hard to live, for one needs warmth. One still loves one's neighbor and rubs against him, for one needs warmth. Becoming sick and harboring suspicion are sinful to them. One proceeds carefully. A fool, however, still stumbles over stones or human beings. A little poisoned now and then. That makes for agreeable dreams. And much poison in the end, for an agreeable death. One still works, for work is a form of entertainment. But one is careful lest the entertainment be too harrowing. One no longer becomes poor or rich. Both require too much exertion. Who still wants to rule? Who obey? Both require too much exertion. No shepherd and one herd. Everybody wants the same. Everybody is the same. Whoever feels different goes voluntarily into a madhouse. Formerly all the world was mad, say the most refined, and they blink. One is clever and knows everything that has ever happened. So there is no end of derision. One still quarrels, but one is soon reconciled. Else it might spoil the digestion. One has one's little pleasure for the day and one's little pleasure for the night. But one has a regard for health. We have invented happiness, say the last men, and they blink. Now, this is Nietzsche's formula for what looks so very different in the communists, especially in Marx's own presentation. Nietzsche says, although he didn't know Marx, disgracefully he didn't know him, he says as it were what Marx regards as his final state of the communist society as a society of the highest culture. This is what you in fact will get. Now, we all know that there is some little element of truth in what Nietzsche says. Some things which we know from our time make it worse. For example, when it says those who feel different go into a lunatic asylum, we know that is not necessary. We just go to a psychoanalyst. We don't have to take this extreme step. But in other respects, Nietzsche doubtless exaggerates from every point of view. I would like to read you a statement by a present-day American sociologist, who is very far from the extremism of Nietzsche. Now, this is Professor Nathan Glaser. He's in a discussion which is not printed, but which I'm sure he would permit me to use. He speaks of the most successful revolution of our age, the organizational revolution or the scientific revolution and its implications. Through this revolution, the gap between the intellectuals, the radical and liberal critics on the one hand, and the organizations representing the status quo, say the War Department, has been closed, or at least very much narrow. The reason was that the intellectuals proved to possess new techniques for making organizations more efficient. One might say that in proportion as the scientists drew all conclusions from their basic premise, which is the assertion that science is limited to factual assertions as distinguished from value assertions, they lost the right to be radical critics of institutions and became the willing servants of any institutions. Does it not make sense? I mean, in order to be a radical critic, you have to have values which you can defend intellectually. Yet, strangely, the cooperation of scientists and men of affairs including generals, has affected the values of the latter. So that one begins to wonder whether there is not a pre-established harmony between the allegedly value-free science and the liberal values. Be this as it may, the questions which troubles Professor Glaser is whether the society rendered possible by the cooperation of the scientists and the managers, the society guaranteeing to everyone simple justice and simple freedom, can be regarded as a good society. I quote, both conservatives or reactionaries on the one hand, and intellectuals and radicals and anarchists on the other, often come together in opposition to what we might call establishment liberalism, unquote. Both the reactionary and the intellectual question the claim of the welfare state, the whole organization, the machine for doing good, to be the good society. Glaser sees only one way out, to improve the organization by setting up the great organization or the big organization or the determining center of allocation, which is enabled to direct all other organizations because it will have far more information and will make much better diagnoses than anyone else can. Hence it will be, quote, the good big society, unquote. But this is a solution not for Mr. Glaser. Alongside it, he predicts there will be developing good small societies composed of reactionaries and anarchists and radical intellectuals. But he is not sure whether the organization will be tolerant enough to let them be, nor whether they will be clever enough to evade it. This is a statement of the problem to which we all are familiar. Then he said, this solution, which seems to be so self-evident, demanded by simple justice and simple freedom, whether this will not necessarily lead to what is ordinarily known conformism, the destruction of all human originality. That is, of course, what Nietzsche meant when he spoke of that star in the dancing star. So, in other words, however plausible the view is that, look around, there is no, for a serious and sober man, there is no question. We know what comes and no one can object to it, no one can complain about it. Yet, if one thinks a little bit deeper, one sees that is not so, and therefore the value question arises again. Now, I would like, last time I began to a discussion of the value-free social science, and I would like now to continue that. I would now like to raise the question, is it possible to understand social phenomena without evaluating? I do not deny that you can understand some social phenomena without evaluating them. That's not the point. But if social science, if we speak of social science, we mean, of course, of all possibles. We think of all possible subjects of social science. And the question is, therefore, is it possible to understand all social phenomena without at any time evaluating? In other words, I'm not concerned now with the practical consequence. I take it for granted that social science is a merely theoretical science. Can it fulfill its theoretical function of understanding social phenomena without evaluating? Now, the general answer would be no, because social phenomena are all of a purposeful character, and therefore they, as it were, demand to be judged in terms of the purpose which they are meant to serve. This kind of immanent evaluation, as we might call it, given this purpose, does it fulfill the purpose, is inevitable. The question arises whether the immanent evaluation does not necessarily turn into an absolute evaluation and not for accidental reason. For example, well, let us start from very obvious facts. The analysis of the last election. It is absolutely impossible to say anything relevant about the last election without speaking of the ineptness of certain men in the run and the non-ineptness of others. This value judgment, if you don't use it, you don't say anything. Senator Goldwater stepped on every toe, one can say. And on the other hand, the handling of the Bobby Baker case was too obviously clever. I mean, these are value judgments, whether we like it or not. But these merely immanent evaluations take on an absolute significance for this very simple reason that the beings judged are not merely running for president or maybe generals or dog catchers for that matter, but they are all human beings, while it's entirely voluntary, or in a sense voluntary, whether you run for president or are a general or a dog catcher or want to become a dog catcher. It is not voluntary for you to be a human being. You are subject to that standard, implied in that, without any possibility of avoiding it. And the beings judged are men, and there are virtues and vices of men. A man who regards war as unqualifiedly bad must make a distinction, nevertheless, between a good and bad general, if he writes military history. But regarding war as thoroughly bad, he must mean the distinction between a good and bad general, like the distinction between a good and bad thief, because here too we have a distinction. But nevertheless, if he is not completely narrow, he must see a difference between the cause to which the thief applies his resourcefulness and the cause to which the good general applies his resourcefulness, or rather the absence of a cause in the one sense, one case, in the case of the thief, and the presence of a cause in the other. Fundamentally, one can state this as follows. We are concerned with political things. What is political? A hard question. But we can answer it by etymologically, or if you please, from the point of view of an earlier age. Political is a derivative from the Greek word polis, the nearest equivalent to which is probably commonwealth. The English word commonwealth is something. Now, a commonwealth has a purpose. It is controversial what that purpose is, but that it is meant to fulfill a purpose is granted. The standards for judging political things are inherent in political things as political things for this very reason. There are very great difficulties here. It suffices to think of the difference between Aristotle and Locke regarding the purpose of civil society or of the commonwealth. But that in which Aristotle and Locke agree is very frequently sufficient for political judgment. And this is, we do not always have to raise the most fundamental question. We can remain sometimes in a more limited horizon. Judgments in this sphere are solid enough, despite the fact that they remain within an area surrounded by darkness. As Aristotle in his wisdom puts it occasionally, to speak politically and crudely. To speak politically means to speak crudely, not to make very refined distinctions which have no political relevance. An example, when Plato presents in the first book of the Republic this old gentleman Cephalos, I think everyone likes that very nice old man, and everyone would wish to have such a grandfather. He is very nice, educated, rather reasonably delicate, and in addition also reasonably wealthy, which is always a good quality for a grandfather to have. Now then, when you read more carefully and follow Plato's presentation, and therewith begin to use the X-rays with which Plato looks through Cephalus, we come to see that this wonderful gentleman has a very seamy side. Now Plato analyzes that. I mean, it still makes him a perfectly nice man for all practical purposes, but only for all practical purposes. Now Plato has a theory of what he does, namely that true virtue, as distinguished from this more superficial virtue, requires a conversion of the whole man, and this conversion Cephalus has never undergone. Plato speaks of that at the end of the Republic, the nice gentleman brought up well and decently, who yet chooses, when at the beginning of the next life, the life of a tyrant, meaning the most unjust life, precisely because he has not undergone this conversion, which according to Plato can be brought about only by philosophy. But that's now let us take a very simple example. A sociologist, writes a sociology of art, A in general or B in particular, of a particular age. And then someone reads it and sees the paintings or whatever which he has discussed are all trash. There is some impossibility in that. He should have called it a sociology of trash, say of the 1920s, and not sociology of art. Now, but what is that distinction between art and trash? But a value distinction, a sense of quality, as the art historians say. There is a prerequisite for being a competent student of art, and therefore also a sociologist of art. Similar things apply to all other parts of the social sciences. Let us take another case which surely falls within the province of any special social science, and therefore of political science in particular. As you know, political scientists, once they have reached a certain age, are supposed to publish. According to as the maxim goes, publish or perish. Now they publish them, and the publication, naturally, because they prefer life to death. But then, after they have published, something will happen which is ultimately as important as a publication. An old hand tells you that. Namely, they will be reviewed. And if the poor fellow cannot bring his publications together with a series of reviews which are favorable, he is maybe worse off than if he had not published at all. Now, in these reviews, we find such statements as perceptive, penetrating, imaginative, deep, broad, etc. And very rightly, because these words indicate the standards with which a scientist or scholar is meant to comply. Naturally, not everyone can apply them properly. That is a great difficulty regarding the objectivity of reviews, and for that matter of science altogether, because you need judgment. And someone might find a certain observation very profound, which is in fact very shallow. There is no protection and no guarantee for that. This vicious circle cannot be overcome. And needless to say that this is one of the great secrets of university life, because all appointments are made on the assumption that the appointers are competent. And how is competence to be judged? Ultimately by very external criteria. He published, can lecture, and so on and so on. Very difficult. But I'm not concerned with this now, with this question. I'm concerned only with this. When people make this statement on scholarly productions, they mean, as the value-free social scientists say, only this. If scholarship, then good scholarship. But why scholarship? So in other words, it's a merely immanent evaluation. I choose, for God knows what reason, but surely not for rational reasons, scholarship. And then, if I have chosen it, then I'm subject to the inherent standards. But this is simply not true to the facts. Because when we look at such statements, or make such statements, we observe that we admire these qualities simply. If we see that someone is perceptive, we mean more than, since he has chosen to be a scholar, he ought to be perceptive. We mean more. It is a quality of a human being, and will show also in entirely different fields of endeavor than scholarship. And the principle, again, to repeat, be that every human phenomenon and every human being is subject to being judged in terms of what is a good human being. And good in the widest sense, not only moral in the narrow sense of the term. Perceptivity has not. A man may be a good man in the moral sense of the word without being perceptive, perhaps, but we mean a good man in the full sense of all human virtues and vices. Now, to come back to the question of how a social science would look which would completely avoid value judgment, I think I would like to illustrate this by an example. Social science must, of course, use concepts, articulate its subject matter in the light of concepts. One very famous one, found or invented by Max Weber being the most outstanding representative of the fact-value distinction, is distinction between the various kinds of authority, rational, traditional, and charismatic. Well, before I would, let me take another more recent example, not as important, but still revealing. For some time, people used, especially at the Hoover Library in Stanford, the distinction between the democratic and the authoritarian personality. Strictly value-free. But if you read that, you saw that it was very value-loaded. I mean, the democratic personality was obviously a nice man, and the authoritarian just an ogre. I mean, not for one moment did they make the attempt to see that there could be an authoritarian personality, say a father or grandfather, old style, who might be quite annoying from time to time, but he would also be very, very good as a guide for young people, and so on and so on. But this is not, the Max Weber case is much more interesting. Now I read to you from the English translation, the theory, Max Weber, the theory of social and economic organization, translated by Henderson and Toggett Parsons. The term charisma will be applied to a certain quality of an individual personality, by virtue of which he is set apart from ordinary men and treated as endowed with supernatural, superhuman, or at least specifically exceptional powers or qualities. These are as such not accessible to the ordinary person, but are regarded as of divine origin. Of course, social scientists cannot say that they are not of divine origin, but they are regarded as of divine origin or as exemplary, and on the basis of them, the individual concerned is treated as a leader. In primitive circumstances, this peculiar kind of deference is paid to prophets, to people with a reputation for therapeutic or legal wisdom, to leaders in the hunt, and heroes in war. It is very often thought of as resting on magical powers. How the quality in question would be ultimately judged from any ethical, aesthetical, or other such point of view is naturally entirely indifferent for purpose of definition, because the social scientist doesn't judge from an ethical or aesthetic point of view. What alone is important is how the individual is actually regarded by those subject to charismatic authority, by his followers or disciples. For present purposes it will be necessary to treat a variety of different types as being endowed with charisma in this sense. It includes the state of a berserker whose spells of maniac passion have apparently wrongly sometimes been attributed to the use of drugs. In medieval Byzantium, a group of people endowed with this type of charismatic warlike passion were maintained as a kind of weapon. It includes a shaman, the kind of magician who in the pure type is subject to epileptoid seizures as a means of falling into trances. Another type is that of Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, who, however, cannot be classified in this way with absolute certainty, since there is a possibility that he was a very sophisticated type of deliberate swindler. So in other words, now what do you say to that? Well, to the honor or dishonor of Max Weber, I have to say that this passage is mistranslated. Parsons apparently hadn't understood at that time what Weber's value-free social science was. Weber says, in effect, that it doesn't make any difference whether he was a swindler or not. So in other words, the difference between a fake charisma and true charisma is already a value judgment, and therefore has no place in social science. But one can rightly say that while it is a bad translation, it implies a sound criticism. The question must be raised. And for the very simple reason, because social science, if it is to be worth its salt, can never leave it at finding out how an authority is regarded by its followers. If a society is subject to a fundamental delusion and regards legal fictions as literally true, then it is the first duty of the social scientist to say that these people were fooled about the character of the authority to which they were subject. I mean, the minimal critical duty of social science. Max Weber himself called the kind of constitutional monarchy which existed in Germany until 1918 sham constitutionalism. In other words, he said, this is not a truly constitutional monarchy, but a barely disguised absolute monarchy. I mean, we will not go now into the substantive truth of this assertion. The main point is that such distinctions are, of course, necessary for the social scientists to make. Is this a genuine constitutional government or only a sham? Yeah, the kind of authority in a given group is to be determined by what the people concerned regard as authority. That is impossible to leave it at that. That means literally passing the buck to people who may very well be less competent than the intelligent social scientist. Is the authority the question of the kind of thing? In addition, this whole doctrine of the source of authority, of the kinds of authority, suffers, I think, from a very grave defect. Naturally, Weber didn't know anything of Hitler, although Hitler would really have to be classified as a charismatic leader in Weber's sense. But would this be sufficient? Would this be adequate, fundamentally adequate? Is it not in every case necessary, apart from these formal characteristics, to ask regarding legitimacy, political legitimacy, as regards the cause, which is a basis even of the claim of the charismatic leader? Hitler was elected and had this tremendous intra-German success, and not merely because he had these immense rhetorical and demagogic and other gifts of this kind, but also on the basis of what he stood for, what he called National Socialism. Can you disregard that when you speak of what legitimacy meant at that time in Germany? Without this cause, all his charisma would not have been helpful to him. I would like to add another point here, and namely that has been observed by more than one reader of Weber, that in Weber's this theory of charisma, rational and traditional authority, there is a value judgment implied, although obscured, as is indicated by the following. Of course, Weber did not start from phenomena like Joseph Smith, and so he took this conception from Christianity, and especially from a certain Protestant lawyer. So, Weber used the expression the routinization of charisma, by which he implies that the original leader, and who has this profound impact on people because of his particular gifts, on this basis the social order cannot last for any length of time, and there must be some substitute for it, the routinization of charisma. And according to Weber, this has taken place especially in the Christian church, when Jesus and the apostles were followed by the organized church. But the very term routinization, whatever Weber might say, implies a value judgment. Routine versus charisma. A last point which I would like to mention in this connection is this, that the value judgments which are strictly forbidden by the ruling doctrine, they may not enter the front door, they come in by the back door, because there is one discipline, not necessarily belonging to social science, but affecting it very greatly, called psychiatry. And here the distinction, say, between adjusted, well-adjusted, and ill-adjusted people enters, which is naturally understood as and meant as a value judgment, whatever the pedantic and strict methodologies of the social science might say in a given case. I would say the only difference between such a value judgment like adjusted or well-adjusted and ill-adjusted compared with good and bad is only that it is very poor. Because well-adjusted, there are perhaps situations in which it is good to be ill-adjusted. I mean, if a child comes from an abominable home, the worse he is adjusted to that home, the better for him. Even if surely he has to go through quite some troubles. And in addition, so it is a very narrow, unthought through thing. Incidentally, I happen to know of one psychiatrist at least who claims that the distinction between adjusted and ill-adjusted, or insane and insane people, is also not scientific, and is because it is a value judgment, and must be treated as such, because what is sanity and insanity is differently understood in different cultures, and therefore we must even avoid that. And ultimately this would of course lead also to the abandonment of the distinction between healthy and sick in medicine or in biology. There will be an occasion to come back to this later. I'll turn now to another consideration which has to do with the question of value-free social science. Now, value-free social science is distinguished from and ultimately opposed to pre-scientific political understanding, because what we loosely call common sense. Because common sense dealing with political or social matters, of course, evaluates all the time. Value-free social science questions common sense and therewith follows a great tradition. The famous example, Copernicus' refutation of common sense. And here we see how poor common sense is compared with the scientific approach, and what worked so well in astronomy, physics, etc., must also be done in the social sciences. Common sense evaluates. For common sense, the judgment X has been in politics for 40 years, and X is a corrupt politician, has the same cognitive status. I mean, there is no logical difference from a common sense point of view. Now, the radical questioning of common sense is, of course, not the work of men like Copernicus, but above all by Descartes. Descartes, who begins the whole philosophic scientific enterprise with his universal doubt, literally understood. He must doubt of everything. And something of this doubt is still visible in present-day social science, when people want to have scientific proof for every assertion. Now, of course, this cannot be taken quite literally. For example, if there are presidential elections every 4 years, if the political scientist makes this assertion, no proof will be demanded from him. This is equally well known to common sense and to scientific political science. Now, the important point here is this, a simple example, that by being used in science, the statement or the truth, however you call it, does not undergo any change whatsoever. So common sense is capable of knowing the truth. This example shows even that science depends on common sense knowledge. That dependence can be shown most simply and also universally by the following consideration. Political science deals with certain activities of human beings. As such, it presupposes that we have awareness of human beings as human beings, or to state it simply, that we are able to tell human beings from other beings, from trees, dogs, stars, or what have you. Now, when a sociologist in a sociology department, or for that matter political scientists and political science one, are sent out with questionnaires to ask people about how they think about this or that subject, very detailed statements, and in the ideal case, so that no the slightest possibility of a misunderstanding by the poor student is possible, very well. But one thing they are not told: how to tell a human being from a non-human being. How to know that they should ask this being here and not this. And how to distinguish that. Where did they? They learned this, of course, in their seminars. No! They didn't learn it in their seminars. They didn't learn it in the college, not in high school, and not in elementary school. Where did they learn it? How did they learn it? I don't know. Most of us would say, I don't know. But we know that we know it. This little thing on which the whole enterprise absolutely depends is not scientifically known, and yet, as I said, the basis of the whole enterprise. Political science stands and falls by the truth of the pre-scientific awareness of political things. Here, the question arises, of course, how are we aware of that truth? How do we become aware of these fundamental distinctions to which I referred between man and non-man? Do we in fact become aware of something? Or is this not rather a convention of sorts embodied in our language, and by learning language we become initiated into that convention? Now this question of how do we know that, there is a name for this kind of question, which I'm sure you have heard. It's an epistemological question. A question regarding the theory of knowledge. And this is a very important and highly respected part of modern philosophy. There is, however, one difficulty. Every epistemology of whichever persuasion presupposes the truth of empirical statements. We try to understand how it is possible that such a thing as perceiving things or perceiving people is possible. And there are all kinds of theories about it. Yet our perceiving things and people is more manifest and more reliable than any theory of knowledge, any explanation of how our perceiving things and people is possible. The truth of any theory of knowledge depends on its ability to give an adequate account of that perception presupposed to be true. It depends on its ability to give an adequate account of this fundamental reliance which we have. That's when I say, I see here a young man, and perhaps give a more detailed description, and there is no question about it, that we are all in this room 122. The fact that we know that is more evident, more manifest, more reliable than any explanation of it, because any explanation presupposes that we know we are now in room 122. I use the word reliance, which is the literal translation, and in this case the best translation, I think, of the Platonic expression for this strange state of things that we know without knowing necessarily how and why we know. When Plato describes in the famous discussion of the various forms of knowing in the sixth and seventh book of the Republic, and there is one stage which he calls, in one version, sense perception, which has here a wide meaning, like our knowing that we are here, for example. And he calls it in the parallel reliance. This, our sense, our knowledge of things and people has the character of such a fundamental reliance. One can state it as follows, what Plato implies. We are in the midst of things. We cannot begin with a clean slate, using only perfectly clear and distinct concepts. We cannot begin at the beginning, but we must try to ascend to the beginnings. In other words, in dealing with human things at any rate, we are in an entirely different situation than mathematicians are, who do begin, and they may begin, at the beginning. We cannot do that. There is an interesting illustration of this state of things. Spinoza was perhaps the first philosopher who tried to present the whole philosophic doctrine in mathematical form, in a book called Ethics Demonstrated in a Geometric Manner, beginning with axioms, postulates, etc., as Euclid had done, and covering the whole, especially dealing with man. The book is after all called Ethics. And then there is suddenly an axiom somewhere, or postulate, which runs as follows. Homo cogitat, man thinks, man is a thinking being. He never defines man. Never defines man. In other words, he is and this is not a mere accident. This is the essential difficulty of beginning in this manner. Now, before I go on, let me first see whether whether I have made myself clear up to this point.
The problem is that I don't think that value-free social science doesn't strike me as being conscious of fundamentally of having a theoretic function, whereas I think the political science, which begins in common sense, is more conscious of fundamentally having a theoretic function. I mean, I know that value-free social science has something that it calls theory.
No, I'm not speaking about, but the theory, I think, is implied in the claim that it is a science in the same way in which physics, chemistry, biology are sciences. And therefore the general notion of science, which has developed in the modern centuries, is their theory of science, which has to be somewhat modified. Perhaps one should say rather as economics is a science, as biology also. And in this sense, common sense has of course no theory as such. Naturally no. That is a point. Therefore it is common sense. But common sense can lead to a theory. I will discuss this later on when I come to speak of Aristotle. But in itself, common sense has no theory.
No, that's correct. But the problem that I'm trying to get at is that I think that theory, that value-free social sciences theory, is practically oriented. Because when you hear a value-free social scientist talking theoretically or abstractly, they always take their bearings from practical...
Yeah, well, this is not necessary. I mean, because a practical statement would have this character. If you want to have this and this thing, you must have. If you want to achieve this end, you must use these and these means. But you can turn this into a theoretical statement by calling the means the causes and the end the effect. Then the practical statement is transformed into a theoretical statement. And therefore, whether the practical intention is very noticeable in many cases in the value-free social science is ultimately irrelevant for the fundamentally theoretical character of present social science. I cannot go now into this question. This is perhaps one of the deepest differences, that traditionally political science, as you know, was regarded as a practical science, not a theoretical science. And this change from a practical to a theoretical science, which took place roughly in the 17th century, is a thing which we have to consider later in this course. Yes?
You mentioned that, for example, that the election for the president takes place every 4 years in the United States is ascertainable both through common sense and through scientific methods. Now I'm wondering whether, quote, common sense, unquote, knowledge doesn't really depend on empirical verification in the sense that we can look back and see that every 4 years an election has taken place. In other words, doesn't common sense, in this case, and perhaps in more cases than this, rest on empirically verifiable circumstances? For example, if a man were coming from another country with no knowledge of the history of the United States, he came to the United States this past year and he saw the way the presidency, how Johnson succeeded to Kennedy, his common sense wouldn't tell him that an election would occur every 4 years. So doesn't this common sense rest on empirically verifiable propositions?
Sure. Yeah, but the question, that is perfectly true, although it is not sufficient, but as far as it goes, it's all right. But the question is this, that positivists, especially the strict ones, would say the empirically verifiable statements are the preserve of science. But to go somewhat deeper, we all make constantly empirical statements. When I say we are now in room 122, so obviously an empirical statement. But there is a difference between empirical statements and empiristical statements. Between ordinary empirical statements, as men make them at all times, have always made them, and statements complying with certain canons demanded by an empiricistic theory of knowledge. This is, as it would amount to ultimately. But if you take, the example which I gave, you are a human being. That is not a human being. It's obviously an empirical statement. But when and we wouldn't question its validity for one moment, but when you do it, when you raise a question, when you imply in a way you cannot be certain that is true unless you know how perception takes place and what gives it its validity, then the whole is changed. For example, it may very well lead to the view, did you ever hear of that, called solipsism? That strictly speaking, you can only say, I have a perception of these and these colors, sounds, etc., which are patterned, and this particular pattern I call a human being, and I have no right to say that this human being is by himself. Have you never heard of it? This is one, and according to a very powerful school now, one cannot go, if one want to be strict, one cannot go beyond solipsism. This is an example of the radical change which the word empirical undergoes when it is taken over by certain kinds of epistemological theories. Surely, there is no question that common sense statements are empirical statements. Whether this is true of all common sense statements is another matter. Mr. Levy, you want to say something?
Value for philosophical scientists if he wanted to not express his opinion as to what he thought was good and bad about what he was analyzing or studying. He would say, and understand a commonwealth, you have to understand what the commonwealth stands for, what its purpose is.
Yeah.
If we all agree with this, and I think we should, why can't the value-free social sciences remain value-free and still say the American purpose is X, Y, Z, the Russian purpose is A, B, C, the British purpose is C, D, E, and I will study the politics of America, Russia, and...
I do not deny that within a limited sphere you may do that, but I believe in the long run you cannot avoid the question. What's the relative merit of these various definitions of the purpose are? It seems because there are points, unless you are completely disinterested in the subject, well, then you shouldn't be a political scientist, I would say. But if you are interested in that, you are compelled to worry. Maybe you do not reach a result, but your worrying about it makes you nevertheless a better political scientist than if you did not worry about it. Simply say, well, let these fools have their prejudice, whichever they like, and I don't care about it. Your understanding even of what these people say can be deeper or shallower, obviously. And this means already to enter into the discussion, to become involved in the dialectics going on within each side as well as between the two sides. I have nothing against that to start in the most modest manner that is always wise to do, but I believe you will be dragged into that when you begin there. The lady, yes?
If I understand what you said just now, it's a matter of determining what is the province of what political science should or should not study, and then it becomes conflict of views as to whether we can ascertain knowledge of absolute value. And when you haven't demolished the foundation of science.
But I didn't speak of absolute values, but take this question.
But that's implicit in what you're saying.
I don't know.
You said that, you discussed Weber. You said that he could not help but make value judgments.
Yes.
And that his claim to not make value judgments was invalid. But the point of whether, in Weberian terms, whether something is true charisma or not true charisma, one, can't make such a distinction because the way Weber defines legitimacy is the way the people perceive it. And so there is no charisma separate from
I know that, but but the fact that Torquat Parsons mistranslated Weber, which of course for which Weber is entirely in no way responsible, indicates the problem. What about the case? I mean, Weber says whether this charismatic leader is a charlatan, swindler, or genuinely convinced is wholly indifferent, provided the followers don't notice it. But still, I ask, must the social scientist not be critical regarding the opinions which followers have of their leader? In many cases, they may not have sufficient evidence to answer the question. And it's not possible. But must they not at least raise the question of whether the authority believed in is actually of that kind as in which it is believed? For example, I gave this simple example. Constitutional monarchy can be sham constitutional monarchy. Is this not and the same? Can there not be a distinction between a genuine charismatic leader, what Hegel called a world historical hero who identifies himself with a great cause, and a clever swindler?
True, but to determine the difference, that doesn't mean to make a value judgment on whether one is
Oh yes, it makes a value. That is I mean,
you didn't say one is good and the other is bad. You say he fits correctly into the category,
No.
and he does not.
No, not quite. Because, as I stated before, perhaps in two general terms to be understood, is this. These so-called immanent value judgments, for example, a good general and a bad general, it can be objectively found out. Yeah? Because one knows a bit which kind of qualities a general must have, and it does have it. It's not an absolute value judgment, because why should there be generals? Why is not war altogether bad, and therefore generals to be as bad as thieves? Where you can also make a distinction between good and bad thieves. But the question arises, is it possible to stop there at this immanent judgment? Is there not a necessity, if you say of a man, now what was the example? A fake and a genuinely dedicated, inspired man, you say this is only for purely theoretical purposes. It goes beyond it, that you cannot arbitrarily put a stop to that. And the fundamental reason, which I try to state in this form, because we deal in all cases with human beings. Whereas it is arbitrary or voluntary, whether a man is a general, a thief, painter, or whatever it may be, it is not voluntary for any human being to be a human being. Yes?
But to make an arbitrary stop, you say you can't, but the man who attempts to make the arbitrary stop is doing that because he believes that the certainty of his knowledge ends at that point.
All right.
So then the conflict resolves on whether we can have absolute value.
But the question is, surely, I mean, if he believes that, he must stop. But his belief may be erroneous.
So that's the disagreement.
That is the issue. That is the issue. Yeah, no, but this, I mean, that is, the word absolute values has so many connotations that I would, which are, in my opinion, wholly superfluous, and therefore I would not like to use it. But let us take this in this way. When I say he is first-rate general, with these qualities, I mean, very outstanding man, the greatest general around, whatever it may be. We can find out about these things a bit in a commonsensical manner, even if we know nothing about strategy, by a certain belief, sensible belief in authority. For example, knowing that Montgomery is admitted to be a very good general, as a British, we can find out whom did Montgomery regard as top generals. This can hurt us a bit. But I do not want to go into this question. The main point is that these in a limited, conditional judgments, like if general, he's good, mean more, turn out to be more than these if statements, because the qualities ascribed, at least some of them, are qualities which we call virtues, distinctions, excellences of human beings. And there we cannot simply say, if you like that, you may, but if you don't, because these excellences have this character that if we realize them, if we are open to them, we cannot but respect or admire them. There's so many. All right. I should have really someone, a kind of chairman. Julian.
Well, I'm wondering whether this just applies in one direction. It seems to me that the argument so far would lead to the conclusion that the factual judgments that have been made by the social scientist in his effort to leave out values are things that must be taken into consideration in any judgment based on values. In other words, you can't ignore whether or not a particular man has the qualities that he's reputed to have, in making a judgment about him. It's not only whether or not these qualities are good or bad if you're making an evaluation, but also whether or not he has them, so that the factual part fits into is necessary for the judgments that we must make as human beings. But is the discussion meant to imply also in the other direction, that somehow the social scientist task, to the limited extent that he said it for himself, necessarily needs value judgments to become involved in it?
I believe so. I mean, there is a possibility of arbitrarily limiting oneself. There are some kinds of questions in which no value judgments arise. For example, in mere statistics. Yeah. In most cases, no value questions would arise. That's possible. But we are now concerned with the question whether you can define the scope of social science as a whole, of all the questions relevant for social science, in such a way that value judgments are strictly forbidden within them. That's the question. I mean, that is, a man may, for example, abstain from making value judgments for reasons of modesty, for sensible modesty, because the case is extremely complex and he doesn't dare to judge. But he would misunderstand himself if this restraint, if he didn't see that this restraint implies that he is on his way towards a value judgment, and he knows he has not yet the sufficient equipment, factual or other, in order to pass a value judgment.
Well, in that case, then there's no disagreement over the fact that the two realms may be different in their nature and the kind of proof that is appropriate to them or that to which they are susceptible may be different. But the point of argument is going that the modern social science is going from the fact of difference into the fact of not being able to pay any attention to. And what the argument then is that, would it be correct to say that it's then that because these questions must be raised, they must be the concern of the social scientist anyway, even though they're of a different nature than the ones...
No, I don't believe that. That is exactly what I deny. There are not questions that in an arbitrary manner it can be done. But in the question, if we are concerned with purpose of things, we have to not only to know the purpose, but the things demand to be judged in terms of the purpose. And this requires that you take the purpose seriously and see even whether it is a sound or unsound purpose. It belongs to that. You cannot separate that. And the great question is whether a value-free social science does not, by its arbitrary limitation, not lead to necessarily lead to misinterpretations. I once discussed the case of a more very famous case of Max Weber's theory of the origin of the capitalist spirit. I'm speaking now from memory. It is roughly this. Weber's thesis can be stated as follows: that Calvinism is a most important cause of the capitalist spirit. Yeah? You have heard of that in college, I'm sure. Now, when you read Weber more carefully, I'm reading carefully, don't leave it as his general statement, you see what he in effect means is that a certain corruption of Calvinism led to the capitalist spirit. That is something very different from simply saying Calvinism. In Calvin's language, it would mean, in Calvin's language, which Weber naturally would not use, owing to a carnal understanding of a spiritual teaching, yeah? Carnal, fleshly understanding of a spiritual teaching, Calvinism led under certain conditions to the emergence of the capitalist spirit. And here you see that the omission of the value judgment, corruption of Calvinism, a lower form, a degraded form of Calvinism, he arrived at a factually untrue judgment. As Tony put it, the Calvinism which became capitalist was a Calvinism which had made its peace with the world, i.e. which had become entirely worldly, which is another way of saying it was not the real stuff. Now, these are not ultimate value judgments, because the question is here left open whether Calvinism is the true religion or the true interpretation of Christianity or whatever. But within these limits we must judge, and that happens to us all the time. In many cases we are unable to judge, no doubt. I mean, I, for example, would be wholly unable to judge of musical things. Well, I naturally don't judge of them. But in other cases, if we are social scientists, we must judge. Now you.
Is it not possible to say that the Calvinist spiritual belief was corrupted without saying that this is a good thing or a bad thing? It's the same question, but you keep coming back to it.
Yeah, but still, but don't you see that in doing that, you cannot state, very good, you cannot go on to more interesting or broader question, except after having made value judgments. That is the point. It's just as you cannot go on in medicine before you have made the value judgment, this is a corruption of the liver. And then you ask, how is that corruption induced by alcohol or whatever it may be. And that is the point. Therefore, I hesitate to speak of absolute value judgment. These are questions which arise in their in a proper manner, so that it is very properly prepared for seeing them, for understanding them, only after a very long effort. Why not proceed in a truly empirical manner, in a way in which we know our bearings and ascend step by step, and not simply say from the beginning, cut these kind of things out because there are value judgments involved, because in this particular limited way, you can be sure of your ground. I mean, you should at least, and if you are not, you shouldn't make them. Yes. No, I think I have first.
Going back to the question of if you need common sense and science.
Yes.
Is your the essence of what you have said in this respect that common sense and science both rest on the same epistemology?
No. Common sense rests on no epistemology. Science, whether it knows it or not, rests on epistemology. In most cases, I believe scientists know that. There is this great change, and this radical change in philosophy connected with the name of Descartes, which is Descartes, the great mathematician and physicist, which is at the bottom of modern science. Common sense, one can say, strictly speaking, there is no epistemology before modern times, but surely common sense doesn't have that. Common sense is, the posture of common sense is that which we all have in ordinary life. Are you sure that this was X who hit Y? Of course I'm sure, I was there, I have seen him. Well, even in that case, errors are possible, as we all know, but still, common sense also knows the ways in which these things can and must be checked. I mean, all judicial procedure is based on some common sense awareness of how such statements of witness, for example, have to be checked. That has nothing to do with epistemology. Yes.
Isn't common sense based on empirically verifiable proposition? That is,
yeah, but what does empirical
proposition is one that can be verified empirically.
Yeah, but what does this mean? For example, if you have this statement, this is a human being to whom I can address my questionnaire, and this is not a human. What does it mean it is empirically verifiable? The one will not say hello when I say hello to him. Is this an empirical proof that the one is a human being, the other is not? What do you I mean, that is a...
Well, I'm saying that, yes, it does raise questions of epistemology, and because science says that we accept only statements which can be verified empirically, resting on the same.
Yeah, to that extent. Yeah, but that is considerably, you see, the divergence of common sense and science comes out in such simple things. Common sense tells us that the sun is rising in the east and setting in the west. Yeah? The earth is moving. I'm sorry. That is, the earth is standing and the sun is moving. Then Copernicus came. And then there came infinitely greater complications later, especially in our century. Common sense has been proven wrong. What does common sense say about heaven, which can stand up after the invention of the telescope? What about the enormous worlds opened up by the microscope, which are wholly inaccessible to common sense as common sense, which require... It would be more helpful to say common sense is unarmed reason. I mean, not armed with telescope and microscope, and science is armed reason. Now, if you state it in this way, the question arises, are there not spheres where unarmed reason is at least as good, as armed. You know what I mean now by armed. It's not the best word, but you understand it. For example, in our relations with human beings, telescopes and microscopes, in our understanding of them and our handling of them, we are not helped in any way by telescope and microscope. If you don't believe me, read Gulliver's Travels, where, when he was in Brobdingnag, where he looked at, in a way, through a microscope, through a microscope, saw the people in this enormous size, and other things of this kind. This, I believe, is in a more practical way the issue. And this also shows the limitations of this analogy, since the natural sciences have led us to a much deeper understanding of extra-human nature than we possessed formerly. The application of the same approach and of the same methods to human things must bring about a similar progress, a radical progress and improvement of our knowledge of human things and human affairs. How's this gentleman first?
You said that social sciences must descend to the beginning, and mathematics, we can start at the beginning. And you gave, as an example of this, Spinoza's sentence about man thinks, and that there was an undefined term.
Yes.
Being man. But aren't there also, I always thought there were undefined terms at the beginning of mathematics also. So I don't see the development in that.
Yeah, but here that is, from Spinoza's point, Spinoza defines all the terms at the beginning. I mean, must you not define a point, a line, plane, sphere at the beginning?
The point was not defined.
Pardon?
You're saying the point wasn't defined? I'm saying I thought the point was an undefined term.
Well then, stigma, Euclid begins, if I remember well, with the definition of point. At any rate, here the key point is this, that the chief subject of the ethics, or at least of 3/5 of the book, is man and human things, and it is not said what man is. Of course, Spinoza tries to do it by simply showing, by saying man has this peculiar quality of cogitation, by making clear what cogitation is. Then we understand from this way what man is. That's the way in which we don't see. Yes. Oh, well, I do not know.
I was going to say that I think the distinction to which most of us are accustomed as a premise of at least contemporary social sciences is not simply the distinction between armed and unarmed common sense, but rather the distinction between common sense between sense perceptions, I should say, along with the aids which sense perceptions employ, such as microscopes and telescopes on the one hand, and on the other hand, what are said to be non-empirically verifiable statements, such as questions of moral and aesthetic goodness.
Yeah, but the question, that is the reason why I was a bit hesitant to leave it at this identification of science and common sense, because for common sense, this distinction doesn't exist. I gave this example. X is so and so long, so and so many years in politics. Empirical statement. X is corrupt. Empirical statement. Yeah? From the point of view of common sense, there's no question. How do they know that he's corrupt? Because they have seen him acting corruptly. Empirical. That this is excluded in a certain manner. Of course, the social scientists, I suppose, would say you can speak of X is corrupt, but you have, strictly speaking, you have to use corrupt in quotation marks in order to explain that this is a popular expression which, when it is used by a social scientist, does not have this simply condemning meaning which it has in ordinary political life.
But if I understand your argument correctly, what you're saying that, although it is true, science concedes that certain parts of our common sense are true without question, i.e. sense perceptions,
by the very act of splitting up common sense into sense perceptions and perceptions of moral or aesthetic qualities, science is denying the primacy of common sense, and only after having set up this arbitrary distinction is it then going to concede part of the sphere of common sense back to it, and by that act it's
yeah, but there are representatives of this view who would not go so far, and who would question that, because, well, look at this very simple thing. Common sense speaks of things, yeah? I mean, commonsensically we do not, when we speak commonsensically of sense perception, we do not mean mere sense data. If I say I see a cow, those are not merely the sense data. Yeah? I mean, if I analyze exactly what is on my retina and so on, and what I know by any other senses, and put these together, that is not the same thing which I mean when I say I see the cow. And therefore, there is a difficulty already here in sense perception. Sense perception, as ordinarily understood, means the perception of things and people. But from this point of view, from this scientific point of view, the question is, what is really sensually perceived? Not merely sense data. And then the great question arises, how do we come from the sense data to the thing? I mean, that peculiar pattern which is constructed in some way or other out of the sense data. This question then arises. And then we see that has something to do with language. And then language is, of course, differs from culture to culture and from nation to nation. And then the question arises, should there not be a truly objective language which is free from all the vagaries of the empirical languages? The extreme answer to that is, of course, to have mathematics as a true, universal and objective language. Now, this whole issue is involved in the question of common sense and science. Yes?
Well, just wondering, couldn't a more sophisticated social scientist, perhaps not stand so strongly on this point of being value-free, but still try to buttress this original argument that's based on this distinction of what's essentially perceivable and what is in trying to ultimately make everything empirically verifiable, by saying something like, when we say we are looking at a human being, or when we say we're in room 122, for example, we're obviously saying something more than just I have an opinion that, or I believe that. And when we say that a man is corrupt, the question arises whether we're merely stating an opinion, or again stating something.
Yeah, but here too, yeah, sure.
Now, the more sophisticated scientist, not the person trying to hold this freeness, might say, well, just as we would say that saying that so-and-so is a human ultimately depends upon a certain convention that grows up in language, that language depends ultimately on our having received certain perceptions on being able to organize perceptions, let's say, or on certain other contingencies. Similarly, the fact that somebody's corrupt, the fact that somebody's good or bad, would also depend upon certain perceptions of the causing of pleasure and pain, and things like that. And again, the best way to find out that so-and-so is corrupt, just as the best way to find out that so-and-so is human, is to hold surveys, for example, to see just what the concepts are in a certain society.
All right, what the concepts are. But this is, the judgments are a different thing. So the concept of corruption prevalent in a society may very well lead to the conclusion of a sufficiently discerning man that A is corrupt. But the general opinion about that A may be that he is uncorrupt because they are not sufficiently discerning. it would be another difficulty. But apart from that, I think one would have to raise the question, one could not avoid it, is the conception of corruption, which is prevailing in a society, a sound or an unsound one? And I believe after all, we want to have not merely to find out what the society thinks and does, but also what kind of a society. And that has very much to do with how deep and thought through and sensible is its views on such matters as corruption are. Well, I'm sorry, I must now stop. We will continue this discussion next time, and I hope finish it. Oh, yeah.